In royal history, perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Every birth inside a palace was treated as a divine event, carefully announced, blessed, and celebrated. But sometimes, a royal birth brought whispers instead of cheers. Behind golden doors, midwives exchanged anxious glances, courtiers went silent, and the royal physician's trembling voice would declare something the crown could not accept: the heir was not normal. For centuries, being born with a visible difference was seen as a curse, a punishment from the heavens, or a shame on the dynasty. And when the difference was the soft face and gentle gaze of a child with Down syndrome, history shows us that many royal families chose silence, or worse, disappearance. These children were often hidden from public view, erased from portraits, their names never entered into official records. The palace would quietly release statements of ill health while behind thick curtains. A mother wept for the child she was told to forget. In some cases, these children were sent away to far estates, monasteries, or private care homes, places where the sound of laughter would never reach the throne. Servants were sworn to secrecy, documents were sealed, and rumors were punished. The royal image, flawless, divine, and superior, could not afford the truth that even kings and queens carried the same human frailty as their subjects. Modern historians and DNA researchers have begun uncovering traces of these hidden children. One of the earliest known remains of a child with Down syndrome dates back to medieval France, buried respectfully among others, suggesting not all were shunned. Yet in royal courts, mercy often gave way to fear. Because in kingdoms obsessed with pure blood, a child with Down syndrome was not just different. They were seen as a threat to the myth of divine perfection. The story you're about to hear isn't about one child, it's about many. Some were loved in secret, others forgotten deliberately. Their existence was the royal family's most guarded shame. From Victorian England to Imperial Germany, from hidden wards to lonely estates, the fate of these children exposes the cruel line between power and humanity, and how far the crown would go to protect its illusion. Because behind every golden cradle, some stories were buried with the silence of the mothers who dared not speak. History books celebrate royal births as miracles, heirs destined to rule nations. But what happens when the heir doesn't fit the crown's definition of perfection? For many royal families, the answer was cruel and consistent. They vanished their own blood. Hidden behind palace walls, many royal children born with Down syndrome or severe intellectual disabilities simply disappeared from public record. Their names were scrubbed from family trees, portraits stopped being painted, and servants were ordered never to mention them again. Sometimes the child would be declared stillborn, even if they were alive, just hidden away, far from the eyes of those who demanded flawlessness from their monarchs. In Britain, one of the most haunting examples was Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. Born in 1905, he suffered from epilepsy and possible developmental delays. As his seizures worsened, the royal family slowly withdrew him from public life. By age 11, he was moved to a remote estate called Wood Farm, with only a nanny for company. The press was told he was delicate. In truth, he was being erased. When he died at just 13, even his funeral was private. His existence to the monarchy was an inconvenience better forgotten. But Prince John was not the only one. A few decades later, Queen Elizabeth II's own cousins, Nerissa and Catherine Bosleon, were quietly institutionalized in a hospital for the mentally disabled. For over 40 years, they were listed as dead in official records, even though they were very much alive. They lived without royal visits, royal titles, or royal care, dying forgotten by the family that once dined under chandeliers. When the truth came out decades later, the palace called it a tragedy of its time. What the public didn't realize was that this pattern stretched across Europe. In Germany, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 with Down syndrome, lived her entire life outside royal duty. Her family loved her, but kept her out of sight, attending a special school, appearing in no formal portraits. She survived, but as a silent shadow of royal perfection's price. Each of these children shared one unspoken fate: to be erased for the comfort of others. The monarchy feared what the public would think, that a royal bloodline could produce a child deemed imperfect, and in that fear, Innocence was buried under generations of silence. But what if I told you? Or even darker rumors, whispered tales of royal heirs who didn't just disappear from public view, but from life itself? Throughout royal history, silence often spoke louder than truth. Whenever a birth strayed from the perfect royal image, the palace turned into a fortress of secrecy. Records disappeared, midwives vanished into remote convents, and servants who asked too many questions were quietly dismissed. But across centuries, fragments of disturbing stories slipped through, whispers of royal children born unfit for the throne, who never made it to adulthood, though not always by nature's will. In some royal courts of Europe, the fear of scandal outweighed the value of life itself. A child born with Down syndrome or visible disability could threaten alliances, shake public faith in divine monarchy, or spark rumors of divine punishment. The simplest solution to those in power was erasure, and sometimes that erasure came swiftly. Historians studying royal archives from the 16th to 19th centuries often find gaps, unexplained deaths, unnamed infants, or misleading birth records. One 18th-century French document mentions a male infant, sickly and unworthy of baptism, born to a noble house. No further mention exists. Another from an Austrian royal estate notes a burial of a child of the court with no listed parent. In such entries, language was the weapon. Words like defect, unsound, or unfit replaced humanity. Some accounts describe children sent to monasteries under false names, where they lived and died as orphans. Others suggest midwives were ordered to ensure no suffering, a phrase historians believe may have meant something far darker. While concrete evidence of royal infanticide is rare, the absence of proof doesn't erase suspicion. Royal secrecy was absolute, and anything that risked the dynasty's perfection was treated as a threat to the crown itself. Most haunting is how similar these practices were across kingdoms, from the Tudors of England to the Habsburgs of Austria. Royal physicians were trained not just in medicine, but in discretion. If a newborn's features suggested Down syndrome, the soft facial lines, almond-shaped eyes, or a weak cry, reports might be amended before reaching the archives. In portraits, babies who lived only days were painted as angels, without a hint of imperfection. By the 1800s, as medicine advanced, some palace doctors began to recognize Down syndrome as a distinct condition. But their findings were often censored, their notes sealed. Even well into the 20th century, the fear lingered not of disease, but of disgrace. And so, the stories of these royal children survived only as shadows in official records, nameless, faceless, and deliberately forgotten. But while the crowns hid their secrets, the science of genetics would one day uncover the truth they tried to bury, and reveal that even royal blood could not escape human imperfection. For centuries, the silence of royal families went unchallenged. The unfit children were buried in unmarked graves, their stories locked away behind velvet curtains. But in the 19th century, something changed. The world began to question the divine image of kings, and science started asking the questions that faith had forbidden. In 1866, a British physician named John Langdon Down described a medical condition he called Mongolian idiocy. It was a crude, racist term by modern standards, but his work marked the first scientific recognition of what we now know as Down syndrome. For the first time in history, doctors began to identify it not as a curse or punishment, but as a biological difference, an extra chromosome. Yet even as the world took a step forward, the palaces stepped back. Royals feared that science might reveal the truth they had spent centuries denying that divine. Blood was no protection from human nature. The idea that a royal heir could be born with Down syndrome struck at the very foundation of monarchy itself. After all, how could a family claim to be chosen by God if their child was born imperfect in the eyes of their people? Behind closed doors, royal physicians continued to hide diagnoses. In family documents, words like delicate, weakly, or simple replaced the truth. Private schools were established for these children, far from the public eye. Nurses were sworn to silence. Medical notes were sealed under royal orders. By the early 1900s, this conflict between science and image grew more intense. European royalty, obsessed with genetic purity, began marrying within narrow family lines. Cousins wed cousins, generation after generation, in an effort to preserve noble blood. Ironically, that same inbreeding increased the risk of genetic disorders, the very thing they feared most. It was a cruel twist of fate. The kings and queens who claimed to be superior were unknowingly creating their own downfall. Historians and genetic researchers now suggest that many mysterious illnesses were unfit. Heirs recorded in royal documents may have been cases of Down syndrome or related genetic conditions hidden under vague medical language. But science didn't stop uncovering the truth. In the 21st century, DNA research on ancient remains revealed that children with Down syndrome existed, long before any kingdom rose, proving that the condition was simply part of humanity itself. A reminder that no amount of wealth, bloodline, or title could rewrite the laws of nature. Still, while science exposed the truth, the emotional scars remained. The crown had traded compassion for perfection, and generations of royal mothers paid the silent price. Because for them, the battle was never just scientific, it was maternal. Behind every royal scandal lies a quiet heartbreak that never made it into the history books. For all the power and splendor that queens and duchesses possessed, there was one rule they could never break. A royal heir must be perfect. And when a mother gave birth to a child who did not meet that cruel expectation, she faced a fate even darker than exile. She was told to forget her own child. The palace did not treat this as a tragedy of nature, but as a failure of duty. A queen's body was expected to produce heirs strong enough to carry the bloodline, beautiful enough to inspire loyalty, and healthy enough to rule. Anything less was considered a weakness that threatened the crown itself. When a royal baby was born with Down syndrome, the physician's silence spoke volumes. The child would be taken away under the pretense of medical care, and within hours, the mother's chambers would be cleared of any trace of the infant's existence. Some queens were told their child had died shortly after birth. Others knew the truth, but had to pretend otherwise. In private letters, uncovered centuries later, a few hinted at their grief through cryptic lines. "I feel the loss of something that still breathes," wrote one 18th-century duchess. Another queen's diary was torn apart by palace officials after she recorded that her angel was taken to the countryside for peace. These women were silenced not just by royal command, but by the unbearable pain of being mothers in name only. Even in the 20th century, little changed. When Queen Elizabeth II's cousins, Nerissa and Catherine Beausoleil, were institutionalized, their mothers were told it was for their safety. What those words really meant was for the family's image. For decades, those women lived in hospitals, unaware that they were related to the most powerful monarch on earth, their mothers. Bound by royal silence, were seen at charity events, smiling for cameras while their daughters sat behind barred windows. History rarely remembers the mothers of these forgotten children. The queens and princesses are remembered for their jewels, their beauty, their diplomacy, but not for the tears they shed when their babies were taken away in the night. In truth, these mothers were victims of a system that worshipped perfection more than love. And the cruelest part, some of them never saw their children again, yet were forced to stand before the world, crowned in gold, pretending nothing was missing. But a few mothers did not obey. A few chose compassion over command and risked everything to protect the children the palace wanted erased. For most royal mothers, the command was clear: obey the crown, bury the shame, and move on. But not every queen bowed to cruelty. In hidden corners of royal history, a few women risked everything to protect the children their kingdoms wanted to erase. Their names may be forgotten, but their defiance still echoes, whispered through diaries, letters, and rare photographs that somehow escaped destruction. One of the most moving examples was Princess Alexandrine of Prussia. Was born in 1915 to the German Crown Prince Wilhelm and Duchess Cicely. When doctors realized Alexandrine had Down syndrome, advisors urged the family to send her away. "The child will bring sorrow to the throne," one court physician reportedly warned, but her mother refused. Instead of hiding her, Cicely arranged private tutors and later sent Alexandrine to a special school in Potsdam, a radical decision for her time. She was not presented to the public, but neither was she abandoned. Cicely even kept Alexandrine's room near her own and ensured she appeared in informal family photos, smiling among her brothers. It was a quiet rebellion, one act of love in a system built on denial. Centuries earlier, whispers tell of another royal woman, a queen of a northern European court, who refused to let her imperfect infant be taken from her. When the physician declared the baby unfit for baptism, she locked herself in her chamber and demanded the ceremony be done anyway. The child lived only a few years, but she ensured his name was recorded in the Royal Chapel's registry, a defiant act of remembrance when others were erased. Historians debate the details, but what remains clear is this: she valued her child's soul more than the crown's image. Such acts of compassion were rare, and they came with consequences. Mothers who disobeyed risked exile, gossip, or being labeled unstable. In royal courts where obedience was survival, love became rebellion. The cruel irony was that the crown, a symbol of divine rule, often demanded acts that no human heart could bear. By the 20th century, as society began to change, compassion slowly returned to the palaces. A few royal families quietly funded schools for disabled children, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps in memory of those lost. But even then, the children with Down syndrome, born into royalty, still lived outside the frame, tolerated, yet hidden. It was as if the world could not decide whether to celebrate their existence or conceal it behind polite silence. But compassion, once shown, has a way of breaking chains. And soon, the public would begin to ask the question the palaces feared most: what were they hiding all along? For generations, the walls of palaces protected not just royalty, but secrets, layers of silence built from fear, pride, and guilt. Every historian who stepped into the archives of Europe's great dynasties found the same unsettling pattern: blank spaces where names should be, missing birth records, and letters abruptly cut off mid-sentence. It was as if entire lives had been edited out of history. Inside these dusty archives, the truth began to resurface, one hidden child at a time. Researchers discovered that in many royal families, there were unexplained infant deaths, sometimes multiple in the same year, with no burial records or medical cause. One investigator studying 18th century royal correspondences described it as a silence louder than confession. In Britain, journalists revisiting the story of Nerissa and Catherine Beausoleil uncovered hospital records that contradicted official royal documents. The sisters were listed as dead in Burke's Peerage, a directory of the British aristocracy, while they were still alive. This wasn't a clerical mistake. It was a decision. A deliberate rewriting of family history to maintain the illusion of flawlessness. When the truth finally came out in 1987, the monarchy faced public outrage, but the sisters, both institutionalized for decades, never knew the world had learned their names again. Historians found similar shadows across Europe. In Austria's Habsburg archives, gaps in royal birth records from the 1700s suggested that several infants born to Empress Maria Theresa's extended family were omitted entirely, their births hinted at in letters but never officially acknowledged. In France, an analysis of baptism registries from noble families in Burgundy revealed children baptized without title, often described only as weak of mind. Some of these children vanished from records within months. But the most revealing discoveries came not from ink and parchment, but from science. In recent years, ancient DNA studies uncovered remains of children from 5th and 6th century Europe who had the genetic markers of Down syndrome. These children were buried respectfully, alongside others, suggesting that ordinary people, not royals, often showed more compassion. Meanwhile, the rulers who preached divine perfection were the ones who buried their children in silence. The truth is now undeniable. Royal blood was never pure. It carried the same human vulnerabilities as everyone else, perhaps even more, due to centuries of intermarriage. And yet, instead of accepting that truth, monarchies built myths. They erased those who proved that divinity could falter. But the past has a way of demanding justice. And as researchers continue unsealing archives and analyzing DNA, each discovery brings the same chilling question: how many royal children were erased before history even began to count them? Today, when we look back at the grand portraits and shining crowns of Europe's royal past, we rarely think about the children who were erased from it. The ones whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never painted. They were born into privilege but treated as if they never existed. Royal children born with Down syndrome or any visible difference were seen as a danger to the illusion of divine perfection that kings and queens built their power upon. But their stories are now resurfacing, and with them, a painful truth: the most powerful families in history hid their most human moments. Historians in the 21st century began unearthing medical letters, sealed hospital records, and private diaries that exposed how far royal courts went to cover their shame. Some accounts even showed midwives ordered to report deformities within minutes of birth, so the infants could be taken away quietly before the public ever learned. In other cases, the royal doctors were paid lifelong pensions to keep their silence. Yet not all were erased without trace. The story of Prince John, son of King George V, stands as a fragile beam of light in that darkness. For years he was hidden away due to epilepsy and suspected intellectual disability. But when he died at only 13, the king himself wept, calling him a dear little boy. Decades later, when his story was made public, it changed how historians viewed royal humanity. It proved that even behind closed doors, love existed, but fear ruled stronger. These stories also reveal something deeper about society. Monarchies represented what their people valued most. If the royal family could not accept a child born different, neither could the public. In that sense, the tragedy of those hidden royal children mirrors the cruelty of their entire age. An era where worth was measured by bloodline, not heart. Now modern descendants of royal bloodlines have begun to speak differently. Awareness, empathy, and acceptance of Down syndrome have grown. Still, historians say there are many more names locked in archives, sealed under privacy laws for the dignity of the crown. It's a silence that protects power but betrays truth. Perhaps one day, when those final records are opened, the world will learn just how many royal children were lost, not to disease, but to the fear of imperfection. Until then, their absence remains one of the quietest, yet darkest, marks on royal history. Because in the end, it wasn't illness or fate that doomed them, it was shame. And that shame belonged not to the children, but to the crowns that hid them.